Hello, my name is Gavin, this is Genre Books, and we are at the end of April, halfway through the Spring into Adventure Booktube event. This is an event where we are reading all kinds of adventure literature. We have a group read, Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. We have some prompts to read non-fiction and fictional adventure from previous centuries. But today I am doing a pulp magazine. No big surprise. Last month I did Spicy Detective magazine for March Mystery Madness, and I'm going with a sister magazine, one of the many sister magazines to Spicy Detective, by looking at Spicy Adventure stories. This is volume 4, issue number 6, from September 1936. Spicy Detective began in April of 1934, and Spicy Adventure followed pretty soon after. Spicy Detective was an immediate and big hit in the pulp world. Spicy Adventure began as an ashcan publication, and these were utilized by publication companies when they have a concept for a magazine and they want to trademark that idea. These were mini magazines that would be produced. These ashcan magazines, usually about 12 pages long, very lazily stitched together, and they would have just enough fiction and editorial content and a few adverts in it to qualify as being a magazine, and it trademarked the title and it registered the copyright in the Library of Congress. That Culture Publications did this with Spicy Adventure and a couple of other spicy titles, as well as snappy titles, is a bit odd. And it's a bit odd for a couple of reasons. The first, probably more germane to Spicy Adventure, is that they did it like this when they followed up with the main magazine so soon after. It seemed a bit odd to need to produce this prototype version to register the trademark for something that they were going to publish as a full-fledged magazine so quickly. And I think the only reason for this could be that Spicy Detective was more immediately popular than they even had envisaged. And the second reason, titles like this weren't trademarked very often. The publishers did not want these schmoosh pulps to really come to the attention of the federal authorities and then potentially censors if they could possibly help it. So there was something for them to weigh up there. They must have had a real fear that someone was going to take these ideas from them, versus alerting themselves to the authorities that they existed. If you go back and watch the Spicy Detective video, you'll see that possibly some of the people they were wanting to protect themselves from are less than savoury characters. In this issue, there are 9 stories, there is 1 comic strip, and there are plenty of fantastically crazy and cheesy advertisements. And I can't think that they were taken with much more seriousness when they were first printed. But we'll start with what I think might be the highlight of the magazine, the first story, and that is the cover story as well. That is The Dragon of Kaohsiung by Sam Walser. Sam Walser is a pseudonym for Robert E. Howard. And this is the third of 5 stories with the same lead character that Robert E. Howard sold to Culture Publications. All of these were published posthumously because the first issue of Spicy Adventures was April 1936, and I think Howard had died in January of that year. All of the 5 stories have the same main character, Wild Bill Clanton. He's hard-drinking, hard-fighting, you want to say hero, but he's not entirely heroic. This story, as you might guess from the title, has some unfortunate Oriental stereotyping, but not as bad, I suppose, as it could have been. We also have a female character here who may not be as innocent as she seems, but she's actually quite a well-drawn, more rounded character than you often find as the lead female character in these stories. I'm not going to try to convince anyone that these stories are Robert E. Howard's greatest work, but they do stand out as being better written than some of the other offerings in this type of pulp, and in fact in this very magazine. To give an example from this very magazine, we have Blood and Fire as the second story by Alan Anderson. Those of you who might be expecting with a title like Blood and Fire for it to be the sexy goings on behind the scenes at the Salvation Army, you're going to be disappointed. But then if you are expecting a tale of Rome and Spartacus to be anything approaching historically accurate, you're also going to be disappointed. For this is a historically inaccurate story of Rome and Spartacus. As far as I can tell, Alan Anderson, if it is a pseudonym, is not a pseudonym of anybody more famous. It's not a disguise to cover up some burgeoning literary career elsewhere. It seems that his speciality, if not his expertise, was historical spiciness, because there is an advert later in this magazine that says that there's another story of Rome coming in the next issue. You get nothing in the way of surprises here in the story. Apparently, slavers are bad. That's the main takeaway. This is a very different interpretation of Spartacus compared to the film you may have seen. It is knockabout fun, but it is very anachronistic. You can tell that everyone is from history because they are all talking in cod Shakespearean language. There are lots of these, lows, tises, and things that probably were not in the original Latin. The next story is by Clint Morgan. Clint Morgan is a pseudonym. It's a pseudonym for Edwin Truitt Long, who also wrote under the names of Carrie Moran and Jose Vaca, amongst others. He would go on to write the Doc Harker stories for the higher class Muncie pulps, and he also didn't invent the character but wrote stories for super detective Jim Anthony. But for 7 years, under a variety of names, he wrote for, I think, almost all of the Culture Publications Spicy stable. He wrote for Spicy Detective, Spicy Adventure, Spicy Mystery, and Spicy Western. And here we have his story, Pygmy Magic. Here some shipwreck survivors are taken in by the natives or the title. I did actually have to look up whether pygmy is something that I could say on a video. It's inappropriate, certainly. Although there are some tribes in Central Africa who are known as pygmies, we're not in Central Africa in this story. It'd be very difficult to get shipwrecked in Central Africa. These natives are around the Papua New Guinea or Indonesia area. We're not entirely sure. The geography is a little bit vague, but that's the area we are supposed to be in this story, and just being short doesn't make you a pygmy. I don't think it's intentionally offensive, but it is inappropriate, and from the modern lens, not something you would want to repeat. This is from the 1930s, and, say it with me, of its time. This is an entertaining enough yarn. The villain, a white man, is totally unhinged, and there are some heroics performed not just by our traditional hero, but also by one of the native ladies of the tribe who helps him. So it's not entirely negative stereotypes. This magazine suffers from what a lot of pulp magazines, and specifically adventure magazines, have. We have exotic, far-flung locations and some antiquated attitudes. It's obviously not the worst thing that's happening in the world in the late 1930s, but there's a lot of stuff here that you couldn't really cheerlead 90 years on. But these magazines are reflecting not only society, but actually the law as well. A very nice pre-civil rights era touch, and not a nice touch, is that a lot of these lost tribes seem to have white women in the tribes who have been lost as children, who have been captured. This is so that our rugged heroes can have a love interest in the tribe, to keep any interracial lustings to a bare minimum. These magazines are not above describing non-white women in sexualized manner, so that is an equality of sorts, but in terms of relationships, they are certainly never consummated. That would probably not sell in many of the states in which this magazine is trying to sell copies. However, we have no such problems with the next story, which is set in far-flung exotic Canada. Death Trail by Clive Trent. Clive Trent is a pseudonym for Victor Rousseau Emmanuel, who also wrote under the names Victor Rousseau, H.M. Egbert, and V.R. Emmanuel, amongst others. He was British born. He is an old Harrovian and went to Balliol College, Oxford. The spicy pulps may therefore be seen as an odd place for Victor to arrive, but he got there via stints in journalism, first in South Africa, and then writing a novel in London before he set sail for New York in 1901. Here he has a novel rejected. He then does some editorial work. He works on the Jewish Encyclopedia for 2 years in 1905 and 1906, which is interesting work considering he later turns out to be a complete anti-Semite. He then writes some children's stories and has more editorial work in Everywhere magazine and Harper's Weekly. More novels followed. They were now sort of Canadian themed, which comes back to this story. But he works for the Argosy, All Story Weekly, Railroad Men's Magazine, and he keeps the wolves mostly from the door with this work and for some screenwriting for Universal Pictures. This is in the 19 teens, but he's only intermittently successful, finding himself back in London. This lack of success begins to tell, and from 1923 onwards he tries again with novels and gets into more problems. He has libel issues with one of the novels, and this is the first of the novels where you could look at it and say, yep, that's anti-Semitic, and there are a couple more that fall into this. I think he then gets over this anti-Semitism, possibly in a feeling of patriotism as Nazis rising to power over in Germany, possibly also because he is just writing about other subjects. He now goes back to the pulps. He writes for Weird Stories, Ghost Stories magazine, Astounding Stories of Super Science, and this writing for the spicy pulps is something that comes very much at the end of his career and is done really as a money thing to make ends meet. Probably not very happy about writing for the spicy pulps, never published under his own name, always under pseudonym. However, as a financial decision, writing for the spicy pulps is a fairly sensible one. They paid quite well compared to other pulps. Whilst you might be getting 1 cent, perhaps even half a cent writing for a science fiction pulp, some of the spicy pulps were paying up to 5 cents a word, so $250 for a 5,000 word story, significantly more than they may be getting elsewhere. And that's because these stories, formulaic as they are, have such a specific formula, it can be quite difficult to stick to it. The story here, Death Trail, is a northwest adventure with a scantily clad woman thrown into the mix who may or may not be in league with the villains. For all his personal faults, there's a nice style to his writing, although there is not, I would have to say, a surfeit of plot. In the middle of the magazine, breaking up the stories, is a few pages of a comic strip. Diana Dore, not that one, by Clayton Maxwell. This strip, the strip is forgettable. It's a bit of nonsense. But what's notable about it is the author. As far as I can make out, and I'm not entirely sure about this, but I think Clayton Maxwell is Robert Maxwell Joff. Now, Robert Maxwell Joff was very much part of the coterie surrounding the culture publications spicy empire. And as we saw in the video I did on Spicy Detective magazine, this company ended up acquiring the rights to Superman. Maxwell, or Maxwell Joff, ended up writing a number of episodes for the Adventures of Superman radio show and TV show as well. And this is a number of years in the future from the period that we're talking about here. But under the name Claire Kennedy, also wrote a number of episodes of National Velvet and of Lassie. In fact, in 1953, Maxwell bought the rights to the Lassie character for $2,000. And as creator and writer of the show, which became phenomenally successful, sold those rights in 1956 for $3.5 million, showing that there is something even more lucrative here than writing about half-naked women. But we're getting 2 decades ahead of ourselves. Back to 1936, I don't think you can foresee any of this success by reading the Diana Dore comic strip. Then we move back to the stories and we see a writer who we covered in Spicy Detective and I spoke about at a little bit more length, and that is Robert Leslie Bellum. A viewer to this channel, Rando Report, advised me in a post the other day that Bellum wrote under no less than 30 pseudonyms, which seems a trifle excessive even for the world of pulp literature. I won't list them all here, but yes, that's quite an achievement. Bellum's most famous creation was Dan Turner, Hollywood detective, but here we have a short story called Carboy of Death. This is, of all the stories in this magazine, the grisliest and bleakest. Not quite on the spicy side of things, although there is a femme fatale. Lou Merrill's Valley of Blood is the next story up, and it is another story and another pseudonym from that man, Victor Rousseau Emmanuel. Here we have an English woman travelling back from Borneo with her husband as part of their colonial service, and there is, I can't remember if it's a shipwreck or a plane crash. It's one of the two. The husband is killed, she's taken by a tribe, and she snaps psychologically and becomes their leader, not only their leader but their mother goddess and their whole reason for being. She leads the tribe, she kills all the other women and makes the tribe worship her. This happens in what I think is modern Brunei. This is quite an odd story, whereas in the first story from Rousseau in this magazine there's some good characterization but very little plot. Here we have an awful lot of plot and some not very believable characterization. But this is followed up with what I think is the weakest story in the magazine. This is John Bard's Blood Has Sticky Fingers. And this story is frankly just a bit of a mess. It didn't really go anywhere. I couldn't quite follow the import of anything that was actually happening. It just seems to be a little bit paint by numbers. But then the quality picks up a little bit with Frank E. Marks and the Queen of Flaming Arrows. This story even has the temerity to suggest a sexy native lady, although the poor woman is dutifully killed off before there could be any consummation with a white man, and makes room for the white lady who has, there's a theme here, taken over the tribe. And we end on something of a high, if you'll excuse the pun, with the story Poppy Dust. This is a story from Willis Vachel Keith. There are some negative elements. There is, as you might imagine, for a story set in the Orient, some elements of yellow peril scaremongering, but on the whole the story is a good one. There is human slave trading, there is drug dealing, there is double crossing, there is secret agents, and it has a lot of the elements that we've been talking about with Spicy Pulps all rolled into one story. And it actually has a fairly decent twist, whereas some of these other stories can sort of just peter out, and others have twists which are telegraphed from the very first paragraph. I've now read 2 of these spicy pulps, and specifically 2 from Culture publications. And if I'm being honest, I can not only notice the formula, but I could probably even tell you what some of the house rules for these stories are. Using the word breast or breasts is fine, and from reading this magazine, positively encouraged, but no using the slang terms for ladies' bosoms, and no use of the word nipple either. If I had £1 for every time breast or breasts was in these magazines, I could retire early. However, another rule is that no women can be described as completely nude. You can be practically nude, nearly nude, but not actually nude. I'm going to persevere with the spicy pulps at least for the next couple of months, but that's because we are coinciding with 2 Booktube events where there is something germane to talk about. For Horror Mayhem, there is Spicy Mystery, which goes into the horror and weird aspects, and I think proved one of the most popular magazines in the spicy stable. And for June on the Range, there is Spicy Western, probably the least popular of the spicy magazines. I'll reserve judgment for a little while longer yet, but I do have the feeling that once you have read one of these stories, you've read them all. Not that they can't be fun, but I'm learning to appreciate that the word gratuitous, which I always thought was a prude's excuse, does have some practical application. And maybe it's just reading these magazines cover to cover that reinforces that feeling. Maybe in the next month I'll try to space out the stories a little bit over a couple of weeks so that the recipe for creating one of these stories is perhaps not so obvious a pattern to spot. Given, however, that a lot of the same writers seem to be employed under a number of different pseudonyms, I'm not expecting huge amounts of variety. But there's always something somewhere in one of these magazines to be a little bit surprising. So I live in hope. And I think maybe after June, I'll give them a rest for a little while at least. But until next time.